24th day of 2023. We have a new guest in the studio for a new conversation. We want to talk about illicit trade in Kenya.
Okay.
Yeah, illicit trade in Kenya. And our guest is the CEO of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, Anthony Mwangi. We welcome him the way we welcome our guests, CT.
Yes, our proverb for the whole of this week comes from the country of Angola. It is the destiny of the donkey to carry a heavy burden.
It is the destiny of the donkey to carry a heavy burden.
Yes, if we're going to discuss illicit trade, there are consequences to it.
Yeah.
And I think the economic consequences, unfortunately, will fall on the already burdened shoulders of
The donkey.
yes, who in this case is the Kenyan Mwananchi. Yes.
Basically, what I'm hearing is even if the donkey hires the best advocate to go and talk about, this burden is too heavy,
It's still your destiny to carry the thing.
it's your destiny, man.
Even if the donkey and all their ilk form a political party and even hold an election.
And reject the legitimacy of the heavy burden.
And even get a new constitution. Somehow, the very, very, very purpose of their lot will not seem to change. They will still be. It's like that's why this proverb is pertinent. It looks like it's their destiny, and you're wondering, but must it be their destiny?
Must it be, really?
Really?
Can it be questioned?
Yes.
Anthony, good morning.
Good morning, Eric.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation,
Thank you very much.
the hot seat of the Situation Room. That proverb, what's your interpretation of it?
I think, the proverb manifests itself, every day. For the donkey, it doesn't have to be that way because that heavy burden sometimes is the abuse of, animal rights. Perhaps it doesn't have to be that heavy. And for the subject of what you're talking about is that the citizens are the victims of illicit trade with heavy consequences on their public health and safety.
Yeah.
So that's why this conversation is extremely important for us to have.
It's a big one.
Yes.
It's a big one. Anthony, you've been at the helm of Kenya Association of Manufacturers now since August.
September.
Am I right? September.
Yes.
So since September, for a long time, we knew the previous CEOs of CAM, the former CS Betty Maina and then Phyllis Wakiaga, and now comes in Anthony. Who's Anthony?
So Anthony has been around for quite some time. I have a career spanning almost 20 years. I have worked for many companies in Kenya, starting with selling photocopiers on the streets of Nairobi, moved on to Samsung Electronics, then after some time moved on to Kenya Airways. That's why I started my public policy life or career. And I did that for 7 years. Then I moved on to IBM for 3 years. 2016, I joined Talo as the director in charge of government affairs, public policy, communication. So all the trucks that you saw rolling the road, down the road to Mombasa taking oil, the dream was to make Kenya an oil-producing country, which we did, albeit small quantities. And then moved on to Bolt as the head of public policy for East Africa, and now CAM. So I've been around for some time.
So your journey now is in public policy.
Yes, I've kept to my lane for the last 15 plus years. That's public policy. Yes.
What is public policy?
Yes.
Very good question. When I was doing my master's in public policy at Strathmore, we spent a lot of time, almost 2 years, trying to define public policy. So there's no single definition of public policy, but the general definition of public policy is any rule, any act, any legislation, regulation that call on public resources that affect public that can be defined broadly as part of public policy. Yes.
Now, the Kenya Association of Manufacturers is a business membership organization, brings in manufacturers from various sectors to come together into this one to be its industry voice, to be its advocate, to lobby for better policy and a better working environment and better markets and creation of markets. Okay. So the assumption here is the members of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers actually produce goods locally.
Yes.
Or they do value addition of goods locally. And then they take those goods to the market. Now, that is all presumably legitimate trade, governed by government, paying the regular taxes and all. What is then illicit trade?
Illicit trade is very broad, right? And it is the trade that is prohibited, contravenes, circumvents the rules, the law, the taxation regimes, the border controls. So it is very wide, right? And there are quite a number of them. Broadly speaking, illicit trade involves, counterfeiting, smuggling, sale of small arms and weapons. And I think also cattle rustling is part of illicit trade. And you need to look at illicit trade in that lens, because here you're dealing with stolen cattle, and here you're dealing with counterfeiting, you're dealing with intellectual property right, which is ostensibly supposed to be protected by the Constitution. Because if you look at Section 40 of the Constitution, protection of property rights, which is a basic function of any government. And then you go to subsection 5, where it is specifically talks about protection of intellectual property rights in any form for Kenyans. So right from the Constitution and all the agencies that have been established to protect both property, physical property, and IP, that is intellectual property. And you look at Anti-Counterfeit, Act of 2008. You look at Anti-Counterfeit Authority. You look at Kenya Bureau of Standard. You look at KEFIS. You look at Animal Act, KWS. National Police Service. All those agencies are supposed to protect the property, which now we say includes a property right. Right? Has it been very successful? No, because illicit trade, and the biggest form of illicit trade in our perspectives is counterfeiting. This is where you deal with legitimate trademarks, and you use that either producing or transporting or repacking or selling without the authority of the IP owner.
Okay.
Right? Is, as I said, is the same as selling a cow that doesn't belong to you. I mean, and now
is that a counterfeit cow?
The trade itself is counterfeit.
Okay.
Okay.
It's smuggling.
So, I mean, obviously, even as you define illicit trade, and it's bad stuff, right? So who's responsible? Whether domiciled or internationally, because oftentimes when we hear illicit trade, it's almost as though it has an international skew, that we have people crossing the borders and behaving in a manner untoward, right? But obviously, from your definitions, that can happen locally. This illicit trade can also be domiciled. Who then are the vanguards of the peace, as it were, when it comes to illicit trade?
First of all, counterfeiting. 80% of counterfeited products are imported products. And it's good to just break down some of those products and the impact that they have on public safety. If you go to buy spare parts, there are a lot of fake, counterfeited spare parts, including brake pads. So we are in a very unique country, because when an accident happens, nobody does the investigation to exactly what caused the accident, other than blame the driver, who is probably dead. But some of those challenges emanate from the products that the brake pads that are used in those cars. Some of them are compressed glass, right? You can actually, that brake pad, you can chip off with your finger. The normal person on the street and repairing doesn't know whether that is fake. Look at pharmaceutical products. emergency pills, contraceptive pills, drugs, ARVs, high blood pressure drugs, all the drugs that are fast moving. And just to step back, counterfeited products are mostly target the fast moving consumer goods, including medicine. Now, if you have a population that is consuming fake medicine on some of these life-threatening ailments, the toll on the individuals and public health and the economy is enormous. You go to things like alcoholic drinks. People are consuming poison.
Right.
It's not the first time that you've had people dying in the country because of losing their eyesight. And those were ultimately the people who pay ultimate price. But there are so many people that are chipped off every day. Their lives are wasting away every day because they continue consuming these illicit, counterfeited alcoholic drinks. But then coming to your question, and there are many. The first to disabuse the notion that the people who conduct this trade are the people we know from political circles, being told that they are being affected by this trade. Illicit trade, the origin of these are transnational, organized crimes and criminals, because no Kenyan has a production line to do fake medicine. And there's a very close nexus that exists, and OECD actually has mentioned, between the proceeds of illicit narcotics trade and funding counterfeiting of goods, because that's how you introduce that illicit gotten money into legitimate financial systems.
In other words, cleaning money.
Wash.
Right.
And then the transportation systems that are used to transport these counterfeited products are the same transport systems used to traffic human beings, wildlife, and narcotics and firearms.
So this is a well-organized drug net. We're not talking about your run-of-the-mill guy who's doing something here. He's a victim.
The guy on the
street on the beat,
is a victim.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is these are people high up in the echelons of this kind of thing that we're talking about. So then going back to that question in terms of then who's supposed to essentially round up the bad guys, it would then be a difficult thing, because that means that those who are running this thing are very, very powerful.
They have become extremely powerful because they have been let to be powerful. And like cattle rustling, it started as small, crime, but now, it is a big problem. It's a big problem. I mean, if you look at the definition of a state, and you look at one of the definitions, actually, a monopoly of violence. Do you think that the Kenyan state has a monopoly of violence over cattle rustlers?
It has sufficient ample opposition.
You see, it has a strong opposition because you have to let it. If you look at even the terrorism and what happened in Somalia, and you find that this, Al-Shabaab allowed to trade in charcoal, then they gain economic muscle, and they're then able to provide good opposition to the Kenyan nation state, and others. So this illicit trade also is a big, big problem. And if left unchecked, it must all start driving, I call it the bad driving out the good. But then you look at who, as you asked, who is supposed to fight this? As I mentioned before, there are many agencies, because these are constitutional issues, many agencies that actually are supposed to legitimately fight this. ACA, that is Anti-Counterfeit Authority, as the people who are created by the Anti-Counterfeit Act, but they're not alone. I mean, the National Police Service, KWS fighting, trade in wildlife, goods. You look at cabs. You look at all the agencies that operate at the port, at the airports, cafes, even plants and fauna and flora. So it's actually a galaxy of
There are
institutions.
institutions that should be doing this.
Yes, and I think that is how the former regime created a multi-agency task force, so that then they can coordinate. Because the more they don't work in a coordinated manner, that's how the trade flourishes.
Are these people known?
Just like any organized crime. Perhaps there are people, and I would imagine the law enforcement agencies perhaps know some of them, but I would imagine most of these, because the international criminals are unknown.
Unknown.
To us. Yes.
So they're known to someone.
We are known to someone. I don't know who that someone is, but they need to be investigated and need to be known. But a lot of it, they're emanating from international, circles.
When you talk of counterfeit goods, I'm just thinking of consumer products, where something is labeled as such and it isn't quite what it's labeled as, because probably there's a brand name attached to it and it isn't really the brand. And I'm looking at what makes these things attractive. Cost.
Yes.
How then you had an organization that is an association of manufacturers? How then does the local industry counter the infiltration of maybe the very, very same goods that they would supply locally, and yet what we're referring to as counterfeit will come in cheaper? It may not necessarily serve the purpose that they promise it will serve, but on the face of it, it is cheap. Like some of these things that come from the Far East. Cheap clothing, cheap shoes. The shoe will last you a week, but it is cheap.
Cheap medicine. I mean, just to add on to that, CT, just a few, actually it's not even years. Last year, there was this whole hoo-ha about this new supposed herbal contraceptive that then had indications of you growing, whatever in the future. But it was cheap. Number one, it was cheap and it was readily available to women across the country. We're not just talking about Nairobi, who'd be able to get contraception for shillings. So there it is. It comes in. And then we'd seen studies afterward that,
It's meeting a need.
It's meeting a need, number
Yes,
one.
and the need
it's
is
meeting
immediate.
the cost, and it's an immediate need. It's cost effective. Nobody's giving any information to counter that it would work.
Yes.
But there's a challenge to that notion. They are not meeting the need. They are sold as goods to meet that need. If you take, for instance, I mean, not you, if Kenyans,
Why not me?
I would imagine you'll be looking at and sometimes you cannot even differentiate
Between real and fake.
Yes. So if you take fake medicine, it doesn't meet the need. It gives you a false hope.
Yes.
So it is the role of the state and government to protect the citizens.
But you see, the need that we're talking about is not necessarily that it will meet the ultimate need.
No.
You are looking for medicine, you want to be healed.
Right.
It is filling a certain gap. One, accessibility. That it's here, it's available, it's accessible, because the others are not available and accessible. So it's in the market, it's where I need it to be.
And if the others
And
are
number
available-
two, it is affordable.
Yes.
It's where I need it, it's within my reach and it's within my affordability. So it's meeting those two needs. Those two are also needs.
You see,
And if it's packaged,
Yeah.
that it's going to address my ultimate need for why I'm looking for medicine, and I don't know any better, then that's what I'm going to go for.
There's always the promise of what it seeks to do, but if you take the argument even to the human habitation, okay? If you look at some of the structures that people live in, and you look at the demands and the standards that are set by the UN as to what qualifies to be human habitation, even an animal that you keep that you don't particularly like should not be allowed to live in some of those structures. And yet, we claim that it is habitation, and people even pay rent to live in some of those things. Again, it meets the need.
These people are victims
Yes.
You know, and you know, it's not universal that everybody has to live like that.
True.
It's because of the failure of successful governments to lift people out of poverty. People don't need to live in the way we live. You know, people don't need to take substandard goods, because a lot of majority of the counterfeited goods are substandard goods. Take an example of things like diapers, you know, and imported and you know, they're worn by children, and then they ban the children, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you can say it meets the because of cost, but this is just people taking advantage of the situation. And that's what we're saying, that it needs to be controlled, it needs to be eliminated, because it chips away and continues to position itself as a legitimate product, but it's not, you know. So in the long run is that you're going to have a big challenge in future. If you, for instance, you're dealing with maize that has full of aflatoxin, would you say it's meeting the need? It's meeting the need for that day, but what that happens a few years down the line? I mean,
It's
we
harmful.
remember Dr. Mwangi, late Mwangi, telling us that you're going to have a big problem in future because of consumption of these illicit things. So it is the responsibility of the state and the government to protect the citizen and raise their living standard.
I think the
Of that
unfortunate-
citizen. There's a question I want to follow up, because CT had asked you, as the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, what is it that is hindering your members from meeting this need that this person is going for? They are comparing very many things. One, they are comparing, is this cup available in my locality? No, it isn't. Is the fake one available? Yes, it is. So why is it the original one available? Is this one cheaper than the original one? The fake one is cheaper. All those things. What are the factors that hinder the manufacturers from being able to provide this?
So, first of all, you know, the reason it's being counterfeited is because it is moving.
Yes.
You know, they don't counterfeit anything, that they don't invent anything new. They go to the market and see what is being sold. And then I'll give you an example. Bottle of water.
Yeah.
If you look at the cost of the bottle of water, the cost of the bottle, you look at the cost of this label,
Yeah.
you look at the cost of the excise, you look at the cost of compliance to cabs,
Yeah.
all those costs will go to the cost of the bottle of water.
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
And because you're a legitimate manufacturer and you're following the rules, you'll incorporate all that. But there's somebody who goes to the kitchen, fills this bottle of water, right? Just looks for the label, put the label as a legitimate manufacturer. But this water has not gone through any process, no licensing, no taxation. Excise stamp alone per liter is 6 shillings and 40 cents. And you go to the market and find that water being sold at 10 bob. So how can you, as a legitimate manufacturer who is paying taxes, you know, and following the rules, compete such a, you know, a product?
Yeah.
That goes for any other product. You know, first of all, manufacturing in this country is such a big challenge, and it's only that people push themselves. Otherwise, if there was an alternative, I don't think people will do that, because it's actually difficult for you to manufacture, for you to comply, you know, with all these rules. It takes an average Kenyan who wants to follow the law 2 years to set up behind the, you know,
A water bottling
bottling company.
It'll take 2 years.
2 years.
And you already have
My
water
family
off
has
the
done
ground.
that. 2 years. It took us 2 years. And we say
And this is just going through the regulation
the
process.
processes. You start with NEMA.
Right.
You start with the county. You go to Warma. It
There's
takes you
Water Resource
another.
Authority.
You go to KEBS. You go to Kerry.
You go to everybody.
Everybody. Now, so the question I think should become is, why is this trade becoming prevalent? It's
Yep.
because also the cost of compliance, the authorities overreach, overlaps. They make it so difficult for people to do business.
And yet they ought
You know.
to be making it easier.
Make it easier. That is the role of government, to make it easier for citizens to invest in their own country. If it's going to take you 2 years, how long does
set up something.
How long does it take anybody who is setting a manufacturing to get a connection with
Kenya Power.
Kenya Power? So this country,
Even
So
when
it's
you
maybe-
offer to do your own substation.
So maybe this illicit trade, it looks as though it's being encouraged, because if you were to go the formal way, I mean, you get a headache. You get a headache in 2 years to set up a business. My
So
goodness.
cut corners and get to the market.
Yeah.
And that's where the role now,
But you see now
of,
that-
of your
yeah.
fellows in the profession,
Yes,
public
yes,
policy,
yes.
also then comes in.
Yes.
Let's discuss that after the break.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
I think, Anthony, just give us the distinction between the fake counterfeits and grey products.
So I think there's the terms, it's just nomenclature,
So it's one and the same thing.
But I think the best way to describe a counterfeit product is just as simple as it's fake, right?
Not from the legitimate producer.
It is mostly substandard,
Okay.
not from legitimate producer, but it is done so well that it
It
kind of
embezzles.
passes as the legitimate product.
Okay.
Companies spend a lot of time, developing the brand, creating the market for that brand, like we mentioned about Minute Maid, they've spent a lot of time. If it was our own individual, brands, you have taken years to build your brand. So if they were unable to counterfeit a human being, I'm sure there'll be a lot of fake Eric Latifs and everyone.
They've tried.
The ambassadors have tried.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's purely fake.
From the get-go.
Yes.
And you say that there's a lot of, from where you come from as manufacturers, you feel that sometimes government policy actually abates counterfeits and works to the disadvantage of the genuine manufacturer because of the entire cost of compliance.
Yes.
The cost of compliance in terms of time and in terms of money.
Cost.
What is it that needs to be done?
So let's just look at the bigger picture about this valley. So the baseline survey that was done by a multi-agency task force led by ACA, that's Anti-Counterfeit Agency or Authority, they discovered that in 2017, the value of counterfeit goods was 726 billion.
In the Kenyan market?
In the Kenyan market.
What?
2018, it grew to 830 billion, 14% increase. If you look at where we are today, we are talking about over $1 trillion shillings. Now, because these are substandard and illicit goods that are mostly smuggled into the country, no duty is paid. So Kenya government could be losing in upwards of 250 billion shillings a year.
In revenue.
Now, when that happens, they can't raise enough revenue. They go back to the same people who are doing legitimate trade to tax more. And what then that happens is that the legitimate people, traders and manufacturers who are doing the actual work of investing and creating jobs, start losing their market share to fake products. And we have estimated as KM that some manufacturers lose, or some industry lose up to 40% of their market share to counterfeiters. Now, if you go to the factories here in town, in Nairobi, in Kenya, almost all of them are operating 50% capacity. What does that mean? That you have installed capacity to produce 24 hours, but you're only working for 12 hours.
Yep.
that compromises even the number of people that you employ.
Yep.
Right now, we're employing, the manufacturers are employing almost 380, 50, 70,000 people at 50%. Now, if you promote legitimate trade, if you promote rule of law, we are not asking for anything else. It is a constitutional issue, it's a legal issue. It is that the government and the agencies in government to perform their role, to protect, rule of law. Right?
Yeah.
If this happens over time, you'll now start seeing people getting off work and companies closing. It's not unusual to hear that companies are relocating from Kenya. There is no investor who will come here and create a product and then it's counterfeited the following day. If you look at the copyright, what we call piracy, and I think musicians have been able to, because you're the same thing,
Yep.
we are talking about IP, they're talking about copyright.
Yeah.
So counterfeit, the sibling on the other side of copyright is piracy.
Yeah.
Trade in your creativity.
Yeah.
So, and you need to allow people to be creative. So allowing illicit trade to flourish only benefits a few people at the expense of millions of Kenyans.
So
But
what
isn't
is
that-
the issue here? Sorry, Ndu.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But isn't that the problem?
Yeah.
That's exactly the issue, and it's not minded that a few people actually are benefiting from this at the expense of millions of people. But that's the point, that there are folks who are into this business for their self-benefit. It doesn't matter that there are other people who face, the consequences of, ingesting or buying or using these products. So we can sit here and moralize it because we obviously know that there's an issue here. But for them, the commercial advantage far outweighs any kind of moral discussion that we're going to have. And isn't that just it? How then do we go about convincing such beyond aside prosecution? Because you're not going to have a conversation about it's right or wrong. The only thing they're going to pay attention to is suffering from the consequences of putting this damage on other people. Which is why I asked then, who is tasked with making sure that those who are involved in this business are brought to book? Because it's criminal. It's criminal. You cannot tell me that you manufacture a product which, after years of use by another individual, is going to cause them some kind of harm or death, for example, and then this person should continue to share the same space and air as everybody else. I mean, that's the only language for me that they would understand.
Air should be snuffed out. Huh?
Yeah, because we can't have a conversation. No, actually, what you're doing is wrong. We can see that you're making trillions of dollars from it, but can we have a conversation about how you can stop?
At
That's
least
not the
you're
language
hiring some people.
Yeah, that's not the language that they will understand because it's commercial for them completely.
Yeah.
So for me, it is about tightening the screws around prosecution.
Yes.
I hear something different though.
Yeah.
We have all these agencies that have been created and they're doing their work. But at the end of the day, what is making the counterfeiter thrive is because he's able to come into the market faster, cheaper.
I think
One of
it's
the ways
not-
of doing it.
It's not.
If the government looked at its own regime, first of all, ease of doing business. How fast do you register a new company? How fast do you register IP? How fast do you recognize that IP? How then look at the cost of doing business? How many taxes am I levying on this one product or this one manufacturer? Even the tax of just transporting goods from the manufacturing plant to the market, as long as you're crossing one county into another, you're paying.
Yeah.
As long as you're crossing from one county to another, you're paying for just branding your vehicle. And branding your vehicle is helping you to get your market share. If the government then looked at all those things and said, I'm going to make it easier for Anthony to be able to package water and sell, then at least you have a leg up in countering the counterfeit. And then out also gives the anti-counterfeit authority, the NEMA, the whatever, all these other agencies, the multi-agency, better work of dealing with the counterfeiters.
Yep. As they say, you cannot eliminate crime. Okay? Crime and society are intertwined. The only thing that you do is to minimize the opportunity. So, and one way, as you've described, it is make it easier for people to do business, legitimate business. ease and cost of doing business in this country is extremely high, right? So it's a contributing factor. But be it as it may, you do not leave it there, because there are also agencies that recognize there could be shortcomings in how you ease of and cost of doing business, which needs to be reformed actually, like yesterday. But then if that happens, you still have to look at how to enforce the rule of law.
Okay.
You have to go to a marketplace and you just tell people, these are the rules. You play by them, everybody. But now you have individuals. You see, crime is very interesting. And look at narcotics. I mean, look at states like, Mexico and other places that allowed some of these things to thrive. It got to a point where you subvert completely the rule of law.
Yeah.
And those criminals were able to face the military in broad day, war on the streets of Mexico. So it is very easy for someone who is doing illegitimate business to infiltrate the law enforcement, to infiltrate the systems that are supposed to, create order, and also, in fact, even plant people within. Look at the port of Mombasa. Have you ever asked yourselves why goods have to come through Eldoret and then come to Nairobi?
The picture you paint of Mexico is a daunting one. Many Latin American countries have that same problem. But our situation is different in this sense. You see, we're talking about criminals infiltrating systems. Here, everybody seems to be colluding. Because the very forces that are supposed to fight the criminals are criminals. Okay? The very people who are supposed to oversight these things are criminals.
That's the problem.
The very people in government who are supposed to ensure that there's protection are criminals. Because we have legitimized and we have said it is okay for people to appear from absolutely nowhere and suddenly become rich overnight. And it is okay. So, even when we talk about this enterprise, a country like ours grapples with something quite different, because this thing, it isn't a question of a habit that we've acquired. This thing is in our bloodstream now. It's something we've mainstreamed it, we've considered it normal. And so even when you talk legitimate, see, at the end of the day, a business person wants to make money. But what they forget is an institution such as the one you had also produce value. Because if the intentions were serious, in my opinion, everything that the Kenyan government could do to ensure they protect their manufacturers so that they can grow would be done. I do not see that being done. Because if they did that, then the Kenyan product, whatever your members produce, would compete favorably.
Globally.
Yes. And the economy that we're talking about would actually grow. But it doesn't.
Now, that is now the quagmire we find ourselves in. Because it is either we grow legitimate business by being globally competitive. And we have many opportunities. If I just showed you, and we've done this mapping of all the sectors, and we looked at the opportunity, we can actually grow this country. But then we have all these headwinds and all these challenges of the costs, ease, and illicit trade. So the business that's supposed to grow a manufacturing base, start small as an SME, grow to a big company, grow Pan-Africa, East Africa, Pan-Africa, and also perhaps go internationally, they cannot thrive. Because the moment their products becomes popular, the Mokoras come in, and then you kill the company. So if this is not done, rule of law, and control the illicit trade and allow legitimate business to grow, we're going to be in the same hole we've been for the last, how many years? Decades.
Many.
Look at the challenge that we're facing on employment. And sometimes we don't contextualize these issues. How many kids did their KCP the other day? How many did their KCSE? Every year, we have millions of Kenyans joining the job market.
Yeah.
Whether they drop off at class 1 or grade 2 or class 8, they're joining the job market.
Yep.
University. Now, if you go back 10 years and assume 10 million people have joined the job market, but how many jobs are being generated? The illicit trade is almost 10% of the GDP. And we talk about manufacturing contribution to GDP. Illicit trade is actually an extraction to GDP. So we're extracting 1 trillion shillings worth every year. The only person who benefits is the person seated in some capital in Far East, you know.
But it
in
still
a bag.
contributes to then essentially what a nation would count as GDP.
But that's not a contribution. And let's use the same example you used about cattle rustling. Are cattle rustlers addition to the GDP?
Of who?
Of who? You know, just
Whose
because they
GDP
sell
are we talking about?
because they sell cows.
stole
They sell
somebody's
cows
cow.
to you know they steal cows and sell. But do they contribute or they extract? Because the people who actually
The people who
you know,
produced the
produce
animal
those-
up to
those
that level.
So, because this is the thing that we're saying essentially that a nation could actually do better. If we're talking about a trillion shillings that has been extracted due to illicit trade, apply 1 trillion shillings, for example, to Kenya's economy today, and what would you then be able to? And I think that is the lens through which we ought to be looking at this thing. That oftentimes you say, okay, until you look at the demerits of something, you will not know how it is affecting you. Or if you look at the merits of actually having this thing, imagine 1 trillion shillings being pumped into Kenya today and what you would then be able to achieve. Is that not enough in terms of impetus to get those who are responsible for streamlining these things to say, okay, guys, let's get this thing moving and see how we can shut down these taps?
and that's why our work as Kenya Association of Manufacturers, we advocate for this and we continue advocating for. I mean, we have limited, tools to really deal with it. We only advocate for the law enforcement agencies, and it's not necessary for us.
Yeah.
It's actually for the citizens of the country.
It's for the entire country and the entire
If
economy.
we cannot be a producing country and resort everybody go back to trading, we're not producing anything. How many people are going to really? What is the future of the country that does not produce, only trades on itself?
Actually, that roadmap is a clear one because every nation we refer to as developed, it's through industry that they got to where they actually got to it. It's not something that is a secret. And yet you will find that alongside that is the national pride that these countries have with that particular industry of theirs. Because they themselves support that very industry. I look at a country like India or China, just given their populations. They don't really need to trade with other people outside their own country to actually make money. You have a ready market in your country.
Organic.
Yes,
Market,
now we have a market as well.
So our market, we have about 5,000 manufacturers for about 48, 51, 52 million people. We are now more, I'm swimming in a smaller pool called Kenya. We have opportunities across East Africa.
Yep.
We have opportunities across Africa. 1.2 billion people. Africa, and this is really sad, the intra-Africa trade is only 11%.
Of
Intra-Africa trade. So essentially
89% of trade in Africa comes in.
89 comes from outside Africa.
right.
Now, within East Africa, and we're one of the most organized, community, perhaps almost like EU, but our intra-East Africa trade is 18%, 19%. EU is
within
70.
East Africa.
Yeah.
Within the 300 million markets.
Yes. Now, look at that in the context of, again, 1 trillion shillings that we're talking about illicit trade. Because illicit trade is the same thing happening in Uganda, Tanzania.
Burundi,
And you
Rwanda, yes.
come from those things here, they go through Tanzania, they come back to Kenya. I mean, it's not once we've talked about things, products being loaded from Port of Mombasa, then they are rerouted back to the country. Contraband.
Duty free.
Yes.
Contraband, smuggling, So, economies that are based on this kind of weak system the future is really, really bleak for us, because just imagine, where you've been, and if we continue on this trajectory for how long? It's like a cookie that will come to crack.
So, Anthony, the people who are in charge of policy in government,
Yes.
there's an whole institution for policy. There are those who advise the government, there are those who make decisions in government, in cabinet policy. They understand these things. I mean, manufacturers and others have talked to government for very many years. There are those who've even sponsored their people to get into government. So why doesn't it change?
Big question. And it's a role for all of us. And we're not apportioning blame here. I mean, I know there are many good policymakers within the systems, but I continuously call it the bad driving out the good. If today you walk into a village meeting and tell people, the CEO, you can't get people jobs, from your village because you're looking at qualifications. You think you're going to be popular, in that conversation? You say, no, it has to be merits. You have to go to school.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that you're better than everybody else.
You earn your place.
Your ethics have to be A1. That's not a very popular conversation. And that's why I call the bad driving out the good. And that's what is happening in Kenya. The moment you allow illicit trade, you continuously drive out the good.
So even messaging.
Yes.
Even messaging.
Yes.
So for instance, if the Kenya Revenue Authority is clamping down on those who may be trying to evade tax in one way or the other, fake stamps and such, then that messaging is strong on the government is serious on fighting counterfeit. Now, if the KRA then backtracks on that, then the converse also happens. That, well, it's free market, bwana. Why am I making stamps when I can just be in the right political side?
Yeah. So the argument, people will say, other countries, develop by faking, But those countries, even if they develop, they faked in their own country. They had manufacturing of fake products in their soil.
They were manufacturing.
Yes. Our manufacturing is
our fakes are external.
Yeah, external.
That's mean what fakes.
I mean, so that argument is fronted a lot in public policy discourse.
Yeah.
And that is driving out the legitimate conversation of saying, yes, but you can see the effects today. You can see the effects today, even for those countries.
Anthony,
yes,
we will invite you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for visiting us this morning. Come again and again. Let's keep talking about these matters and all we need to see our country develop.
Thank you.
Anthony Mwangi is the CEO of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers. He'll be here again and again and again. We'll